Hugh Rowland wasn't always the tough and determined trucker viewers came to know on Ice Road Truckers. Before the cameras rolled, Hugh lived a much different life, one that wasn't filled with the freezing dangers of the Canadian ice roads. He was a man of many layers, someone with a past that few people knew about. But what led Hugh to take on the ice roads, and what was the journey that made him a star on one of the most dangerous reality shows ever created? When Hugh first appeared on Ice Road Truckers, he quickly gained the attention of viewers not just because of his skills, but because of the way he handled himself. He wasn't the kind of person to shy away from a challenge, and that was what made him stand out. The show was all about survival, and Hugh had survived a lot before even stepping onto the ice. However, what many didn't know was how far back this adventure started. His road to becoming a famous ice road trucker didn't begin with just a desire for adventure. It began with a need for something greater than himself. Growing up, Hugh wasn't exactly the person everyone expected to end up behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. His early life was full of struggles and a desire to break free from the ordinary. He didn't want to follow in anyone's footsteps. He wanted to carve out a path that was uniquely his. But like many people, Hugh found himself in situations where he had to make difficult choices. He had dreams, and sometimes those dreams took him down unexpected roads. It wasn't always easy for Hugh, and there were moments when it seemed like his dreams were just out of reach. The ice roads, for Hugh, weren't just a way to make a living, they were a challenge. He saw them as a test of both his skills and his mental toughness. But what was it that drew him to these deadly roads? Was it the thrill, the money, or something deeper inside him that pushed him to take risks most people would avoid at all costs? To understand why Hugh chose this dangerous life, you have to dig deeper into who he really was and what motivated him. Hugh was no stranger to danger. Before becoming one of the most well-known truckers on TV, he had already spent years working in tough jobs that required a great deal of risk. Whether it was working in remote parts of Canada or handling heavy machinery in harsh environments, Hugh's life had already been shaped by difficult circumstances. He wasn't afraid of the ice roads. In fact, he saw them as a place where he could prove himself in ways others never would. The ice roads were unforgiving, but they were exactly what he needed to test his limits. It wasn't just about surviving on the ice, it was about the kind of man Hugh wanted to be. Every time he drove through those dangerous paths, it was as if he was proving something to himself. But there was always a question lingering in the back of his mind: was he truly ready for everything the ice roads had to throw at him? The fact that Hugh became part of Ice Road Truckers wasn't a coincidence. His unique background, his resilience, and his ability to thrive under pressure made him the perfect candidate for a show that required more than just driving skills. It required someone who could handle the emotional weight of risking their life every single day. People could see Hugh's passion and determination, and that was exactly what the producers were looking for. But at the time, no one could have predicted how big the show would become, and how much it would change Hugh's life forever. As the show gained popularity, Hugh's fame grew. He was no longer just a trucker, he was now a reality TV star. People watched as he navigated icy roads, facing the kind of dangers that most people could never imagine. He became a symbol of strength and resilience, someone who could do what others couldn't. But as his fame grew, so did the pressure. There were moments when the weight of being a public figure began to take its toll on him. How much could Hugh handle before everything started to fall apart? Despite the challenges and dangers of his job, Hugh stayed focused. He wasn't just in it for the fame or the money, he was in it for something deeper. It was about the journey, the drive, and the opportunity to prove to himself that he could conquer whatever life threw his way. But as we all know, the path to success is rarely straight. And for Hugh Rowland, it wasn't long before the ice roads would reveal a tragedy that would change his life forever. How far could Hugh go before the ice roads became more than just a challenge? The mystery surrounding his rise to fame was only the beginning, and what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Would the ice roads prove to be more than he could handle, or was this just another test on his long, difficult journey? Hugh Rowland's life before he became a star on Ice Road Truckers was a story of ordinary beginnings, a man with dreams and ambitions, yet someone who had to fight through many challenges. As a child, Hugh didn't come from a family of truckers or anyone with a history of working on the ice roads. Instead, his early years were filled with hard work and a desire to find a career that was truly different. He grew up in an environment that didn't offer him many easy paths to success, and like many young people, he had a deep hunger to escape the ordinary. Hugh didn't want to live a typical life. He wanted something that would allow him to prove his worth, to show that he was more than just another person trying to fit in. At first, Hugh didn't know where this desire would take him. His dreams were big, but his options were limited. He worked in various jobs, each of them teaching him valuable lessons, but none of them satisfying the deeper need he had. Hugh wasn't just looking for a paycheck, he was searching for an adventure, something that would push him to his limits and make him feel truly alive. These early years were filled with self-doubt, and yet there was always something inside him that kept driving him forward. No matter how tough things got, Hugh knew that he needed to make something of himself. This restless energy inside Hugh led him to explore different types of work, including jobs that were physically demanding. Hugh found himself working in industries that involved heavy machinery and tough conditions. While many people would have avoided such work, Hugh embraced it. It wasn't just about the paycheck, it was about the challenge. He started to develop the kind of skills that would eventually make him stand out. But even then he wasn't thinking about ice roads or being on TV. He was simply trying to find something that would allow him to survive, to feel like he was doing something worthwhile. But then something unexpected happened that changed the direction of his life. One day Hugh came across the idea of ice road trucking. This world, which seemed so far removed from everything he had ever known, drew him in. It wasn't just the idea of driving on dangerous ice roads that intrigued him, it was the very idea of being part of something so extreme. The ice roads represented a challenge that no other job could offer, and that's what Hugh needed. It was a way to test his limits, to see if he could handle the kind of danger that most people would avoid. The decision to become an ice road trucker was a turning point in his life, but it didn't come without hesitation. It was a decision that would shape his future in ways he couldn't even imagine at the time. At first, the thought of working on the ice roads was intimidating. Hugh had no formal experience in this kind of work, but there was something about the ice roads that called to him. They were harsh, unforgiving, and filled with risks, yet Hugh felt that they were exactly what he needed. So he took a leap of faith and began training. The learning curve was steep, but Hugh was determined. Every day he pushed himself harder, learning how to drive under the most extreme conditions. The ice roads didn't care about who you were or where you came from. They only cared about whether you could survive them. Hugh, however, wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to master the ice roads, to prove to himself that he could overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead. The deeper Hugh got into ice road trucking, the more he realized that the dangers were not just physical, they were mental as well. Every day Hugh had to battle his own fears. He was constantly reminded that one wrong move could be his last. Yet despite the overwhelming risks, he found himself becoming addicted to the thrill. The ice roads tested him in ways he had never been tested before. Each day was a new challenge, a new test of his abilities, and each day Hugh grew more determined to master the art of ice road trucking. However, Hugh's journey wasn't as smooth as it may have seemed. As he grew more experienced, he faced more difficult situations, each one testing his resolve. He quickly realized that ice road trucking wasn't just about driving on icy roads. It was about the mental strength required to keep going, day after day, in an environment where one small mistake could lead to disaster. Hugh understood that more than anyone, his ability to face danger head-on was part of what made him a great ice road trucker. But with each passing year, the risks grew more apparent, and the emotional and psychological toll began to weigh on him. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally, and though Hugh loved the challenge, there were days when it felt like everything was closing in on him. The more time he spent on the ice roads, the more he began to question his future in the industry. Was it worth it? Could he keep pushing himself this hard? The long hours, the isolation, and the constant fear of danger began to take a toll on Hugh's personal life. It was hard to maintain relationships, and the stress from the job often followed him home. There were times when he wondered if the thrill of the ice roads was worth the price he was paying in other areas of his life. Despite all of this, Hugh remained determined to succeed. He continued to push forward, refusing to let the dangers or the toll of the job slow him down. But as time went on, the pressure mounted. The fame that came with being a part of ice road truckers only added more weight to his shoulders. Hugh was no longer just a trucker, he was a public figure, and with that came expectations. He couldn't just be good at his job, he had to be great. People were watching, waiting for him to succeed or fail. This new reality made everything harder. The pressure to keep performing at a high level, both on and off the ice, was constant. Hugh's story was far from ordinary. He had gone from an unknown worker to one of the most well-known truckers in the world, but with that fame came a price. As the world began to watch, Hugh had to question whether he was truly ready for everything that came with it. Could he continue to live a life on the edge, constantly testing his limits, or was it time to step back and reassess what really mattered? There's a moment in every dangerous career where you start to wonder if you've gone too far. For Hugh Rowland, that moment came while driving on the ice roads. These weren't just any roads, they were thin sheets of ice stretched over deep, freezing waters. The conditions were brutal and the risks were so high that many people avoided them altogether. But for Hugh, the thrill of the ice roads had become more than just a job. It had become a challenge, a test of his endurance and skill. But as with many risks, the danger wasn't always obvious. It wasn't until something went terribly wrong that Hugh's life changed forever, and the haunting memories of that incident would stay with him for the rest of his career. The day of the tragedy started like any other. Hugh was on the ice facing the usual dangers that came with driving on frozen roads. He had done this countless times before, each time believing that his experience would keep him safe. But this day would be different. A sudden shift in the ice, an unexpected crack, or maybe just the wrong decision at the wrong time. Whatever it was, it happened so quickly that Hugh barely had time to react. The truck began to slide, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. In that instant, Hugh realized he was in a situation far beyond his control. It wasn't just a close call, it was the kind of moment where life and death seemed to hang in the balance. Hugh had seen many close calls on the ice roads, but this was something else. The truck slipped and he felt that familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you know something's wrong, but there's nothing you can do to stop it. He had always been prepared for danger, but this time it felt different. The ice road that had once felt like a challenge now felt like a trap. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his heart racing as he tried to steer the truck back on course. But it was too late. The truck plunged into the ice-cold water below, and in that moment everything changed. In the aftermath of the accident, Hugh's life was thrown into turmoil. He was lucky to survive, but the emotional and physical scars would remain for years to come. This was the moment that turned his life upside down. The aftermath wasn't just about fixing a broken truck, it was about coming to terms with what had happened. The accident had shaken him to the core. Hugh was left to process what had gone wrong, why it had happened, and what it meant for his future. The adrenaline of being on the ice road was no longer enough to drown out the haunting memories of that day. The once thrilling challenge of surviving on the ice had turned into a reminder of how fragile life really was. Hugh had always been the kind of person who pushed through adversity, but this was different. The ice roads had always been his arena, his place to prove his strength, but now they had become a place of fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ice roads had betrayed him. The danger he once embraced now felt like a shadow that followed him everywhere he went. Every time he returned to the ice, it was harder to shake the memory of that accident. Could he keep going? Could he continue to work in an environment that had almost taken his life? Despite the heavy toll the accident took on him, Hugh pushed forward. He didn't let the fear control him, but the memories were always there, lurking beneath the surface. It was almost as if the tragedy had changed him, made him see the ice roads in a new light. Every time he stepped onto the ice, there was a part of him that wondered if it could happen again. He knew the risks, he had always known them, but now the reality of those risks weighed on him in a way it never had before. The ice roads had always been a challenge, but the tragedy added an emotional layer that Hugh couldn't ignore. He had always been a fighter, but this was a battle within himself. The doubts began to creep in. Was he really prepared for the kind of danger that came with ice road trucking? Or had he underestimated the risk all along? These were the questions that haunted him every time he got behind the wheel. He had to face them head on, even if it meant confronting his own fears. The accident also had an impact on those around Hugh. His family, friends, and even his colleagues noticed a change in him. The once fearless trucker who would laugh in the face of danger now seemed more cautious, more hesitant. Was he still the same person? Could he ever go back to the way he was before the accident? The people who had watched him for years began to wonder if he was truly ready to continue down the same path. Some questioned whether he would ever be able to return to the ice roads, while others feared that the emotional toll would be too much for him to handle. Despite all of this, Hugh knew that he couldn't just walk away. The ice roads had become a part of who he was. They were not just a job or a challenge, they were his identity. But now it felt as though that identity had been shaken to its core. Was it possible to continue on this path without the same fear consuming him? Could he still handle the dangers of the ice roads after everything that had happened? These were questions Hugh had to answer for himself, even if he didn't have all the answers right away. The tragedy also brought attention to the extreme nature of the work Hugh and his fellow truckers faced. While the ice roads had always been known for their dangers, the accident made people realize just how much these drivers were risking. It wasn't just about driving a truck, it was about surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The reality of the dangers became much clearer, and it made people wonder just how much longer Hugh and others could continue in this line of work. In the end, Hugh's tragedy became a turning point in his life. It didn't just change the way he saw the ice roads, it changed the way he saw himself. He was no longer just a fearless trucker, he was someone who had faced death and come out on the other side. The question was, how would he move forward? Would he continue to take on the ice roads, or would he walk away from the danger that had nearly cost him everything? Only time would tell if Hugh Rowland could find peace after the tragedy that had shaken him to his core. The days after the tragic incident were some of the toughest Hugh Rowland ever faced. It wasn't just the physical scars he had to heal from, but the emotional and mental toll that seemed to weigh him down more than anything. For someone like Hugh, who had spent so many years fighting through tough conditions, the idea of feeling broken was foreign. He had always prided himself on being tough, both mentally and physically. But after the accident, he found himself questioning everything about his life, his choices, and his future. It was a painful realization, he wasn't as invincible as he once thought. The first few weeks after the accident were the hardest. Hugh couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and fear that lingered in his mind. He knew he had made the right choices to survive, but it was hard to ignore the fact that something had gone terribly wrong. The fact that he had come so close to losing everything made him question his purpose. Was this really worth it? Was the thrill of driving on ice roads worth risking his life every day? He had always considered himself strong, capable, and fearless, but now, all of that seemed to have been shattered. The constant reminder of what had happened gnawed at him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the truck sliding, the ice cracking beneath him, and the chilling water rushing in. That image haunted him. It was a memory he could never escape. But even through all the pain and confusion, there was a part of Hugh that refused to give up. There was still a spark of determination deep inside him, urging him to keep going. The ice roads had been a part of his life for so long, and though the accident had changed him, he wasn't ready to walk away. The struggle wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about coming to terms with the emotional damage. Hugh had always been the kind of person who dealt with challenges head-on, but this was something different. The emotional weight was heavy, and the fear he felt after the accident was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if the ice roads had become his enemy rather than his battlefield. Over time, Hugh began to realize that his recovery wasn't just about returning to the ice roads. It was about reclaiming his sense of self, the same self that had been so sure of his abilities before the accident. He had to face his fear, not just the fear of driving on ice again, but the fear of losing his confidence, and the fear of letting down the people who had been watching his journey all along. He had always prided himself on being strong, and now, he had to prove to himself that he could be strong in a new way. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Hugh thought about quitting. There were moments when the fear felt so overwhelming that it seemed impossible to keep going. But there was something in his nature that wouldn't let him walk away. The thought of leaving the ice roads behind felt like admitting defeat, and Hugh wasn't ready to do that. He had been through too much to simply give up. Yet, as much as he wanted to keep going, he knew he couldn't just jump back into the ice roads without confronting his fear. The mental battle was just as important as the physical one, and Hugh knew that if he didn't face his emotions, he wouldn't be able to continue. Slowly, he started to rebuild. It began with small steps, taking on lighter challenges, gradually regaining his confidence. It wasn't about rushing back into the toughest conditions, it was about proving to himself that he could still handle the job, even after the tragedy. He surrounded himself with people who supported him, people who believed in his ability to overcome this obstacle. The people who cared about him reminded him that the person he was before the accident hadn't disappeared. He was still the same Hugh Rowland, and the ice roads still needed him. Even as he took these first tentative steps back into the world of ice road trucking, the pressure was immense. Every time he drove, he couldn't shake the nagging fear that something might go wrong again. It was a constant mental battle, balancing the need to prove himself with the fear of making the same mistake. The eyes of the world were still on him, watching his every move. There were no second chances. It wasn't just about his career, it was about his identity. Hugh had built his reputation on being a tough, fearless trucker, but now, that image was at risk. The emotional struggle was one he hadn't prepared for. He had trained for the icy roads, the dangerous conditions, the brutal environment, but nothing had prepared him for the mental challenges that came after a life-threatening experience. Despite all the doubts and fears, Hugh kept moving forward. He didn't allow himself to get lost in the past. Every day he reminded himself that he was still capable, still strong, still able to handle whatever came his way. The road back wasn't going to be easy, but it was a road he had to travel. And as time passed, Hugh began to find a new sense of peace with the ice roads. The fear didn't completely go away, but it no longer controlled him. He had come to understand that fear was part of the job, part of the challenge, and that it was something he could use to push himself further. In time, Hugh not only returned to the ice roads, but thrived once again. He found his confidence, his passion for the job, and his drive to succeed. But he was no longer the same man he had been before the tragedy. He had learned the importance of balance, knowing when to push through, and when to step back. He had faced the deepest fears and doubts, and in doing so, he had become stronger. The road ahead was still dangerous, but Hugh Rowland was ready to take it on, not just for the thrill but for the sheer love of proving that he could survive anything. Hugh's journey was more than just a return to the ice roads. It was about overcoming the mental and emotional challenges that came with such a dangerous career. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't just a trucker on the ice roads, he was someone who had faced tragedy, survived, and found a way to keep going. His story became one of resilience, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of never giving up, even in the face of overwhelming odds. After the accident, there was a noticeable shift in Hugh Rowland's life. The road he had once traveled with confidence, even with all its dangers, now felt uncertain. There were days when it felt as if he had been standing at a crossroads, torn between two choices. One path was the familiar one, the life of an ice road trucker, filled with adventure, risk, and the thrill of overcoming the most dangerous conditions. The other path was unknown, but it promised a chance for a different kind of life, one with less risk, fewer dangers, and maybe even some peace. But could Hugh ever truly walk away from the ice roads? Would he be able to leave behind the job that had defined him for so many years? For a long time, Hugh found himself stuck in this inner conflict. He loved the ice roads. They had become more than just his job, they were a part of him. The challenge, the adrenaline, the sense of survival, these things had become a huge part of his identity. But after the accident, everything had changed. The fear he felt after the crash was something he hadn't expected. It was more than just the fear of dying, it was the fear of losing control, of not being able to trust himself anymore. The moment he stepped back onto the ice, it wasn't just about driving a truck, it was about facing his own vulnerabilities and fears. The pressure to keep going was enormous. The world had been watching him on ice road truckers. He had become a well-known figure, admired by fans and respected by his peers. But now, with the weight of the tragedy on his shoulders, he wondered if he could still live up to the image people had of him. It wasn't just about being a great trucker anymore. It was about whether he could find the strength to keep doing something that had nearly cost him his life. As time went on, the internal struggle didn't go away. Hugh had moments of doubt, where he wondered if the life he had chosen was really worth the price he had paid. His physical injuries had healed, but the emotional scars were more challenging to deal with. The thoughts of the accident, the cold, the cracking ice, and the water rushing in never fully left him. Each time he thought about returning to the ice, the fear would creep back in. But there was another part of him, the part that had always pushed through hardship, that refused to let go of the life he had known. The idea of walking away from ice road trucking seemed impossible. Hugh had spent years mastering the craft. He had made a name for himself, gained respect in an industry that didn't hand out respect easily. He was proud of what he had achieved, but now that pride felt overshadowed by doubt, could he still do this job with the same passion and skill he once had? Or had the accident changed him in ways he couldn't reverse? What kept Hugh going, despite the overwhelming fear, was the sense of purpose he found in his work. The ice roads, despite their dangers, were where he felt most alive. They were where he could test his limits, where he could challenge himself in ways no other job could offer. For years he had found meaning in surviving the toughest conditions, and it wasn't easy to let go of that. But this time, it wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving again. Gradually, Hugh found himself returning to the ice, but with a new mindset. He had changed since the accident, and he wasn't the same fearless man who had once driven without hesitation. Now he approached the ice roads with caution, but not fear. He had learned to respect the danger, to understand the risks in a way he never had before. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't immune to the dangers of the ice roads, but he could navigate them with more wisdom and awareness. There were still moments when Hugh felt the pull of fear, but instead of letting it control him, he learned to use it. The fear became a tool, something that reminded him to stay focused, to be mindful of every decision he made. The ice roads, which had once felt like a place to prove his strength, were now a place for him to prove his resilience. The challenge had shifted from conquering the ice to mastering his own mind and emotions. Could he overcome the fear that had once nearly destroyed him? Could he still perform at the highest level after everything he had been through? It wasn't just about getting back on the ice, it was about accepting that he had changed. Hugh couldn't go back to the old way of doing things. He couldn't pretend that the accident hadn't happened, and he couldn't ignore the lessons it had taught him. The challenge now was to find a new balance, one where he could still pursue his love for the ice roads without allowing the fear and trauma to consume him. It was about finding a way to continue doing what he loved, while also respecting the fact that the ice roads were dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes unforgiving. As he returned to the ice roads, Hugh found that his perspective had shifted. He was no longer trying to prove himself to others, or even to himself. Instead, he was focused on surviving, on making it through each day, with the knowledge that he was capable of overcoming whatever came his way. It was a humbling experience. The accident had stripped away the bravado, and left Hugh with a deeper understanding of who he really was. The man who had once thrived on fearlessness now embraced vulnerability. He wasn't afraid to admit that he was scared, that he had doubts, but he wasn't going to let those doubts stop him from doing what he loved. The pressure to be perfect, to always perform at the highest level, slowly began to fade. Hugh had learned that it was okay to not have all the answers. It was okay to have fears and to face them head on. The idea of perfection, which had once driven him, was replaced with the understanding that resilience was more important than strength. Resilience wasn't about never falling, it was about getting back up after you've been knocked down. And that's exactly what Hugh had done. He had fallen, but he had found a way to rise again. As Hugh continued his journey, he began to see the ice roads in a different light. They were no longer just a place of danger, but a place of growth. They were no longer just a challenge to survive, but a place where he could prove to himself that he was capable of handling whatever life threw at him. And in the end, that's what made Hugh Rowland's story so remarkable. It wasn't just about being a great trucker, it was about being a great survivor. Someone who had faced death, lost part of himself, and found a way to keep going. Hugh Rowland had always been a man of action, someone who took risks and pushed his limits every single day. The ice roads had been his arena, his battlefield, where he faced nature's worst and came out on top. But after the accident, the meaning of his work changed. It wasn't just about conquering the ice anymore. It became about understanding the true cost of the life he had chosen. The ice roads had always been dangerous, but after his close call, Hugh started to realize just how fragile life could be. It wasn't just about driving a truck on dangerous roads, it was about recognizing the importance of survival and the limits of what he could endure. As the months passed, Hugh began to reflect on everything he had been through. He thought about the accident, the fear that had gripped him in those moments when he thought he was going to die, and the mental toll that followed. He had spent so much of his life focused on the challenge of driving on the ice, on being the best, on never backing down from anything. But now, after everything that had happened, Hugh found himself questioning what really mattered. Was the thrill of the ice roads worth the constant danger? Was the fame and respect he had gained from his career enough to justify the risks? There was a part of him that had always craved adventure, that had thrived in the chaos of the ice roads. But after the accident, that part of him was quieter, more hesitant. The confidence he once had in his abilities had been shaken. He had always prided himself on being able to handle anything, to face danger head-on, but the truth was, he wasn't invincible. He had learned that the hard way. The accident had forced him to confront his own vulnerability, something he had never done before. It had made him realize that no matter how skilled or experienced he was, the ice roads could still take everything from him in an instant. Despite all of this, Hugh wasn't ready to walk away. He couldn't just leave behind everything he had worked for, everything that had shaped his identity. But he also knew that he couldn't keep pushing himself in the same way he had before. The accident had changed him, and he had to change with it. The fear he felt when he returned to the ice roads was a constant reminder that things were different now. Every time he got behind the wheel, he was aware of the danger in a way he hadn't been before. The ice was no longer just a challenge, it was a reminder of everything he had been through. But as Hugh faced his fears, something remarkable happened. He started to realize that fear didn't have to control him. Instead of letting it paralyze him, he began to use it as a motivator. The ice roads were still dangerous, but they no longer had the power to intimidate him the way they once had. He had faced the worst, and he had survived. The memories of the accident were still there, but they no longer defined him. He had learned to accept them, to understand that fear was a part of the job. The challenge wasn't to eliminate the fear, it was to keep going despite it. As Hugh continued his work, he became more aware of the responsibilities that came with it. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the people who depended on him, the fans who looked up to him, and the fellow truckers who shared the same dangerous roads. Hugh began to see his role on the ice roads in a new light. It wasn't just about proving himself or seeking glory. It was about setting an example, about showing others that even after the worst had happened, it was possible to rise again. He wasn't just driving a truck across the ice anymore. He was teaching others the importance of resilience, of never giving up, even when the odds were stacked against you. This newfound sense of purpose gave Hugh a new perspective. The ice roads were still dangerous, but they no longer held the same power over him. He had faced his fears, and now he was determined to make the most of every day he had on the ice. He wasn't sure how much longer he would continue driving on the ice roads, but he knew that for as long as he did, he would do it with a sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly survive. Hugh's journey wasn't just about physical survival anymore, it was about mental and emotional growth. He had learned that being strong didn't mean being fearless, it meant acknowledging the fear and continuing to push forward anyway. The ice roads had once been his greatest challenge, but now, they were a place where he could demonstrate the power of resilience. Hugh wasn't the same man who had first stepped onto the ice roads all those years ago. He had been changed by the accident, but in many ways, that change had made him stronger. His story became one of inspiration, not because he had conquered the ice roads or overcome every obstacle, but because he had learned to embrace his vulnerability and continue moving forward, even when the odds seemed impossible. Hugh's courage wasn't just about surviving the dangerous conditions of the ice, it was about surviving the emotional journey that followed. It was about facing the hardest moments of his life and coming out on the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. And so as Hugh continued to drive the ice roads, he did so with a newfound respect for the dangers he faced. He had learned to accept the risks, to understand that life was fragile, and that sometimes, the greatest challenge wasn't surviving the ice, it was surviving the aftermath of everything that came with it. The ice roads would always be dangerous, but for Hugh Rowland, they were also a place of growth and strength, a place where he could continue to prove to himself and others that no matter how many times you fall, you can always rise again.